Welcome to the Western Region Pastoral Institute. This is Old Testament lecture number 2 on geography. On the Google Plus page, you should be able to find a PDF of some maps that are necessary for this lecture. On the video of the lecture, I'm hoping to have a screen share of those maps, so you can either follow along on the video if they're visible and legible, or you can just pull up the PDF, print them out, or follow along on another device. Or just as you're listening on the audio, you can just follow along with the maps. Hopefully I'll be able to direct you to the appropriate places on the map so you can follow along. So today we're going to do some video of the, I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because the maps didn't come up on my screen share. So let me get those up and then I'll have the presence of mind to talk. So what we're going to do is walk through a series of maps. And I want to talk to you about the importance of the maps or the locations or the nations or whatever might be helpful as we look at the map. So this is a map of the Middle East, and the section where it says the desert occupies the nations of Jordan and Iraq. To the south of that would be Saudi Arabia. To the north of that would be Syria, and then to the west you have Israel, and the bottom left-hand corner you have Egypt. The top left-hand corner you're heading up into Turkey. So that's what you've got here, and so what we'll do is we'll start here on really what we'll be looking at are the trade routes, or just even the travel routes that were common in the day. And what you'll notice, just like any map, the darker lines are the maps, are the larger roads, the more well-used roads. The smaller lines are the more inaccessible roads or the rougher roads. And the word the desert is placed in the middle of that so that you would see that the way of travel is forced, not through the desert, which would be very difficult, but up and around the desert. So if we start on the right-hand side of the map, you see where it says ancient coastline. You have the city of Ur. That would be the starting point of Abraham's journeys. And most likely Abraham would follow that dark line, which followed the Euphrates River, which would be a natural path of travel in the ancient world. Accessibility to water being the critical factor in the Middle East and with travel. So Moses would have traveled along there over towards the coast and then headed south into the land of Canaan. Obviously, the more direct route would just be go due west, but that would not be a travel path that would be recommended. So this is what we see here then on this map would be the travel pattern of the ancient Near East, and the kingdoms of this time frame would either be in the Egyptian area or the Iraqi area. And so travel between those kingdoms, as you see, would pass directly through the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel then is a very strategic nation. This part of the world would be very strategic in the ancient world. The passage between these nations would run between them. So the Via Maris would be that major highway that would be used to travel between Egypt and any of the Babylonian, Persian, Assyrian kingdoms over in the Fertile Crescent area. This is critical to know and to recognize that Israel is a very strategically located piece of property. always has been. And this is critical because we really don't have a lot of sea travel. So the Great Sea that is mentioned there, the Mediterranean, would not have been a primary source of travel. And so you're really going to see people traveling through the nation of Israel. The other highway of note for our purposes in talking about Old Testament history would be the King's Highway. Again, connecting the south of the down towards the Gulf of Aqaba, the Sea of Alat, and up and down the spine of the nation of Israel would also have been the pathway that would have been used as an approach for the nation as they were in the wilderness, as they approached the promised land. So just a kind of a big lay of the land and a little bit of thinking about how travel would have happened in those days and how travel was funneled really through the nation of Israel. So, for instance, I don't think I have a map of this later, when Joseph is sent into slavery by his brothers, on this map, probably his brothers were shepherding somewhere up near the Megiddo area. He would have lived further south, and being in Bethlehem would be further south. He would have traveled up there, and when the Midianite traders were seen, they were most likely on this Via Maris highway, and they would have just kind of shoveled them onto the highway, and there you go, and the natural destination would have been Egypt. So now as we slide down to another map here, we'll start here with the rivers of the Garden of Eden. This is just really more curiosity because we really don't know the location of two of the four rivers. Two of the four are the very famously known Tigris and Euphrates in the Fertile Crescent. A lot of speculation about where the other rivers are, and here's one of those speculations, is that those other rivers may be actually located in Egypt. Now that opens the door for a fascinating conversation, but the thinking is reflected in this paragraph here over to the right, where it says the Pishon and the Gihon may not have been identified and may have merely been symbolic, but since Havilah is one of the regions of Cush mentioned in Genesis 10:7, it would seem that the two major branches of the Nile, the blue and the white, are intended. So just an interesting curiosity there. As you scroll down a little bit further, we're going to see now this map here that's associated with the Table of the Nations. And this Table of the Nations is found in Genesis chapter 10. There's a belief on the part of early peoples, Israelis, flowing from this genealogy in Genesis 10, that the world's population was divided up into these 70 different nations. They flow out of Noah. And so the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are listed on this map. And the descendants are claimed to have gone to these different areas and begun to fulfill the great command to fill the earth. And so this idea about the 70 nations actually continues into the time of Jesus. And it's what I think Jesus is referring to by selecting 70 to go out and spread the gospel in Luke. And that is a direct correlation to this 70 nations that are listed in the Table of Nations. And so this is one of the curious divisions of the world's population based upon that early identifier in Genesis. As we scroll down, this is one of the very controversial parts of geography, and that is, which way did they go? So the Exodus and the route of the nation of Israel as they wandered is an often discussed and much debated topic of geography. This particular map leads or shows the nation going in a direction you may not have thought about before. actually north and then south into the wilderness of Zin. The Red Sea or the Reed Sea being designated by that body of water up there on the north part, kind of more like an inlet in the sea, actually. So that's one of the theories. This next map gives you a different theory, that the crossing wasn't done to the north over by what is noted here on this map, Pelisium, but actually the travel was south. They crossed here. It's what's known as the Bitter Lakes, and then down into the Sinai Peninsula, and then wandered through here, this being the traditional site of the Sinai Peninsula. And I don't know if you can see my mouse on the video, but this down here in the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula is the traditional picture of where the nation of Israel wandered. And then eventually, as you can see, heading on up from here, this would be that location of that King's Highway. So they may have traveled at what may have preceded the King's Highway. It may or may not have been in existence at that point, and then crossed over the Jericho, the Jordan River into Jericho. Now, recently, there's been some more talk about an alternative location that follows this route initially the same way, but doesn't find the location of Sinai here on the Sinai Peninsula. But the thinking is that since Moses, before the Exodus, after he killed the Egyptian taskmaster, headed to Midian and spent 40 years in Midian with Jethro, where he married Zipporah and had his children, that the location of the Exodus actually took the people all the way across here, and that the actual crossing of the sea was the crossing of the Gulf of Aqaba, and that the Mount Sinai is actually here in the Saudi Peninsula. Interesting archaeological things that have been discovered here. Apparently, in this Gulf of Aqaba, there is a table, a shallow table that may have served as a land bridge. And some of the excavations that have been done on this land bridge have actually discovered wheels that match chariot wheels from Egypt. And on the Arabian Peninsula, there's some archaeological finds that may possibly match some of the accounts from the Exodus story. So what you would have here is that Pharaoh actually pursued the nation of Israel all the way through the Sinai Peninsula to the Gulf of Aqaba. And that's the hard part of the story. That's an awful long way for a large group of people to find themselves staying ahead of a small army on chariots. But nonetheless, we really don't know the exact route of the Exodus, just so you know that there are several different perspectives on it. Another important map to familiarize yourself with would be a map of the conquest and the settlement. So here we have a map of the 12 tribes of Israel, this one taken out of the back of my Bible. The other maps that I've shown you up until now, with the exception of that very last one, have been taken from the Macmillan Bible Atlas. But this particular map here is from the back of my Bible, probably very similar to the maps you would find in the backs of your Bibles. And generally every Bible map will have this designation of the different tribes of Israel in the promised land. One interesting note, the nation or the tribe of Dan is typically located here on the western part of Israel. This would be very close to modern-day Tel Aviv, and this southern part strip down Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Gaza would be modern-day Gaza Strip. Now, according to this map, this particular map, Judah occupies that strip where the modern-day Gaza Strip is. But many people believe that that was Dan's tribal portion. And if you look up at the top here of the map, north of the Sea of Galilee, you'll see the city of Dan. And so what has happened here with the tribe of Dan, and it's somewhat confusing in the text because some of the texts have Dan in the north and some of the texts have Dan where it is on this map. But apparently what happened is that this section here, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, all of these cities, Eglon, these are cities of the Philistines. And the Philistines were one of those nations that the nation of Israel had a very, very difficult time rooting out. And so apparently what happened is that Dan migrated to the north and occupied this area up in the north where the city of Dan is. And this later became the place where the tribe of Dan is said to have existed. Now, if you can go on to Wikipedia, you will see that there's an erroneous entry on Wikipedia that actually says that this was the portion of land that the tribe of Dan was given, but that's not correct. The portion of land that they were given is this portion here, and apparently because of their inability to excise the Philistines out of the land, and for reasons of relief from the constant tension with the Philistines, much or all of the tribe of Dan migrated to the north. Interestingly enough, this has become one of the geographical markers in the language of the Hebrews. As they describe their land, they would talk about from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan would be the city typifying the further northernmost point of Israel. Beersheba down here in the south would be that marker of the most prominent town in the southern part of Israel. So it became known as the northern part of Israel, even though their initial portion was here in the west. So that's a map of the tribes of Israel. Important to kind of know some of that and their delineation. This map is a map of the extent of the kingdom under Solomon. Now, we're told that Solomon divided the kingdom where he had 12 officers that occupied the land. And now this is an interesting development because the tribes and the tribal divisions is a conquest era designation for the ruling and the governing of the land. That was dependent upon a priestly and a priestly governance or a priestly presence throughout the land. The priests didn't get a portion of land. They were scattered throughout the land. And the governance of the land of Israel we see goes to pot in the book of Judges, which leads to the desire for a king. And so apparently under Solomon, he's seeing the need for some sort of organizational chart. And so I think he basically follows the tribal designations and assigns governors or officers to rule in these different areas. The nation of Israel finds its largest occupation of the promised land under Solomon. In fact, Solomon's occupation of the land is claimed to have covered all of the promise. And unfortunately, I don't have that verse. I should have written it down. But I'll make a note of it on the Google Plus page where it talks about the height of the kingdom on it. Lucky for you, I found it. 1 Kings 4:20. 4:21 says, "Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life." The corresponding passage would be in 2 Chronicles 9:26. So the extent of the kingdom of Solomon went to the river, which would be the river Euphrates, which if we go back to this map, we can see would be all the way up here and extended all the way down to the river of the Nile, which there's some debate as to what river is being spoken of there. But the claim being in Kings that Solomon occupied the promised land as promised by God to Abraham. Here's a map of the kingdom of Assyria. Assyria is one of the first kingdoms that begins to challenge the nation of Israel very soon after Solomon's tenure is up. The divided kingdom, the Assyrians rise to power and set their sights on the nation of Israel. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom, which is known as Israel after the division of the kingdoms, the southern kingdom is now known as Judah. The northern kingdom is defeated by the Assyrians and occupied by the Assyrians. Interesting note, you want to be aware of this. There are two ways that foreign empires would subjugate distant nations that they occupied. One of the ways was by sending parts of their population into these new countries with the intent of intermarrying and integrating. This would cause a sense of allegiance, at least on the part of offspring, back towards the mother nation. And if not a sense of allegiance, at least a sense of division, that their loyalties would be divided. And that was the Assyrian methodology. They would send Assyrians into their occupied territories to intermingle and to marry. And in that way, they would overtake those nations. It is from that intermingling that we get the New Testament people known as the Samaritans. They are the, quote, half-breeds, unquote, that are the result of the Assyrian domination of the northern kingdom of Israel and their integration into that kingdom and their intermarriage there. And that is why the Jews of the New Testament time looked down upon the Samaritans, because they saw them as half-breeds and sellouts. And it's because of this movement of the Assyrians in 722 BC that overtook the northern kingdom. This next series of maps is in the wrong order, so we'll start with the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire is the empire that follows on the heels of the Assyrian Empire. It is a short-lived empire. As you can see, it only existed from 606 to 536, but the extent of their kingdom is fairly large. They essentially swooped in and overtook the Assyrian Empire. Their methodology was a little bit different. So we have the story of Daniel as a reflection of their methodology. Instead of sending their people into these occupied territories, they would go into these occupied territories and pull out the strongest, the smartest, and pull them back to the empire for indoctrination. And so we have the exile, we have Daniel, the story of Daniel, who is taken to Babylon. We have that marvelous psalm, by the waters of Babylon. And there is a desire for a return. Because of these occupations, what we have really occurring now is the beginnings of what's known as the diaspora. Because once you have these occupying territories, occupying empires invading the nation of Israel, not only do you have people who stayed and were overtaken and people who were captured and exiled, but you also have refugees. So from this period on, you begin to have the nation of Israel begin to be scattered throughout the Middle East and beyond. And this becomes, again, a vehicle by which God will use to spread the gospel. When you have pockets of Jewish people all over the world, you now have open doors for the apostles as they go, places for them to go and sit down in synagogues and share the gospel with that diaspora. So it's a very important part of how God used his judgment eventually to become a blessing. The judgment of the occupation, the destruction of the nation, the destruction of the temple, the scattering of the people eventually becomes the method by which he uses to spread the gospel. It's a very powerful picture that you want to be aware of. After the Babylonian Empire, we come to the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is the empire responsible for the restoration of the city. Ezra and Nehemiah are sent back to Israel by the decree of Cyrus. Cyrus is a Medo-Persian emperor, and this begins the restoration of the city and the temple, and really begins to close up the book of the Old Testament. We begin to enter into the 400 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew. Just for your perusal, this is from the Haley's Bible Handbook, gives you the world powers of biblical times. Helpful just from the standpoint of that, gives you some dates and the movement of history. One final thing, the Persian Empire gave way to the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire is best known by Alexander the Great. And the Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great's death, is a very scattered empire. Lots of infighting, lots of battles. And so the nation of Israel becomes kind of a pawn in the battle between these warring and battling and combating power structures in the Greek Empire system after Alexander. So two groups that you need to be aware of that play a role in the nation of Israel's development between the Old and the New Testament are the Ptolemies. That's spelled Ptolemies, the Ptolemies. They are the splinter group from the Greek Empire that ruled in Egypt, and their tentacles often and for the most part reached up into Palestine, Syria, till about the year 200. At that point, you have another Greek general and group called the Seleucids, and they really are the ruling part in Syria, and they have what are called the Syrian Wars in the 200s, the early or late 200s, if you're counting backwards, and they take over the area of Palestine or Israel. And the key figure from the Seleucids that is important for you to be aware of is a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's one of the guys who desecrated the temple, brought pig's blood into it, and all sorts of things, and really gave rise to the Jewish rebellion under Judas Maccabeus and the Maccabees. And that period of time is really what kind of leads us into the New Testament. So that's the remnants of the Persian Empire, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. They have a very important impact on the Middle East. All right, so that's kind of an overview of geography. Hopefully there was some helpful and good stuff for you there. So get your reading done. Just a note for the 2015 class, I'm doubling up lectures, so this will be the first lecture this week. We'll probably have another lecture this week, but I'll try to keep it right around this, about a half hour. All right.